You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Meet the most capable CR-V Honda has ever dreamed of. The all-new CR-V Trail Sport Hybrid. With all-terrain tires and available enhanced traction control, it's built for wherever the day takes you. Heated front seats and a heated steering wheel, ideal for winter drives and crisp early starts. And with generous cargo space, it's ready for big gear and even bigger getaways. The CR-V Trail Sport Hybrid. Learn more at honda.com/CRV.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 497 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we spent the last couple of episodes talking about the heavy casualties suffered by the armies during the Overland Campaign in the spring of 1864 in Virginia. And we also discussed the physical misery and psychological strain the soldiers endured. We wrapped up the last show by asking just what was being purchased by all this death, injury, and suffering. And we said that as the month of May wore on, soldiers and civilians alike grappled with that question.
Their opinions mattered because they had direct implications for morale and motivation. Soldiers who think they're winning generally fight better than those who think they're losing. And in a democracy, civilian opinion matters just as much, since it factors into the home front's willingness to sustain the cause and support elected officials who will see the fight through to the end.
And although the armies were fighting all across the South in the spring of 1864, most notably in Georgia, where William Tecumseh Sherman and Joe Johnston were locked in a struggle for Atlanta, nonetheless, the eyes of the public were disproportionately focused on the conflict in Virginia, which Northerners and Southerners considered the war's decisive theater.
The prevailing opinion among federal soldiers during the first 2 weeks of May was that the campaign was going well. They thought, quite mistakenly, that they had hurt the rebels worse in the wilderness than the rebels hurt them.
It impressed them even more that after the first blows, they were still on their feet, something that had rarely happened before when the Army of the Potomac tangled with Robert E. Lee. As one soldier put it, quote, "We attacked Lee and were not repulsed, which is saying a good deal."
An even more important factor in making the wilderness seem like a victory was Grant's decision to continue southward after the first blows, rather than retreat back across the Rapidan.
But the strongest evidence of all was the victory at the Mule Shoe, where the Federals had not merely broken Lee's line, but they had captured over 3,000 prisoners and 20 pieces of artillery and fended off everything Lee could throw at them, finally forcing the Confederates to construct a new line of entrenchments a mile to the rear.
To most of the Union soldiers, that looked like a victory. On May 16th, one Federal declared, "We have had the best of the fighting so far, and it's my opinion that General Grant has got Lee in a pretty tight spot." Another Yankee said, "We have been fighting for 10 days now, and I think on the whole the Rebs have got rather the worst of it. On the whole, I think Grant has outgeneraled Lee."
The Lincoln administration was also pleased. Upon receiving the first reports of the fighting in the wilderness, John Hay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, confided in his diary, quote, "The president thinks very highly of what Grant has done. He was talking about it today with me and said, 'How near we have been to this thing before and failed. I believe if any other general had been at the head of that army, it would now have been back on this side of the Rapidan. It is the dogged pertinacity of Grant that wins."
And Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, after the fighting at Spotsylvania, wrote, "Everything looks auspicious for the Republic."
If the federal soldiers were optimistic about the outcome of the campaign and the Lincoln administration was upbeat about Grant's leadership, the Republican newspapers were ecstatic over the common impression of events. On May 9th, the New York Times trumpeted, "Glorious news! Defeat and retreat of Lee's army! Immense rebel losses!" And the New York Herald announced, "Victory! Splendid success of General Grant."
On May 10th, the New York Tribune editorialized, quote, "There is no longer any doubt General Grant has won a great victory." It went on to say, erroneously, that Robert E. Lee was in retreat toward Richmond, that Winfield Scott Hancock had pushed straight through Spotsylvania, and that Second Corps headquarters were fully 20 miles south of the Wilderness battlefield. The Tribune concluded, quote, "The military power of the rebellion has received a fatal blow."
However, not surprisingly, newspapers aligned with the Democratic Party were more subdued. After all, in an election year, the Democratic press couldn't afford to admit that the Lincoln administration was winning the war, but it couldn't sound defeatist either. It therefore had to walk a fine line between cheerleading the Overland Campaign's gains and pessimism about the Lincoln administration's prosecution of the war as a whole.
And so, on May 10th, the New York World soberly warned its readers that reversals might lie ahead and to, quote, "fortify their minds against discouragement," end quote. But with its headline that same day, the world joined in the general exuberance after the Wilderness, quote, "Victory certain, a race for Richmond."
Both Republican and Democratic papers got their news from a mixture of correspondence reports and official dispatches from the front, which they proceeded to interpret as best suited to their preferred editorial slants. Every major New York paper had at least a half dozen correspondents with the Army of the Potomac. And although those correspondents managed to get their stories back to their home newspapers with relative ease, the papers still relied on periodic dispatches from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who relied in turn on observations by his man in the field, Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, and on dispatches from Grant.
Ostensibly composed as official correspondence meant for Major General John Dix, commander of the Department of the East, with the headquarters in New York City, Stanton's dispatches were in fact fed directly to the Associated Press, and they invariably contained restrained but shrewd editorializing, which was designed to send the message Stanton wished to get across by using phrases such as, quote, "Our forces not only maintain their ground, but are preparing to advance," which leads to, quote, "the hope of full and complete success."
But the most famous one went forth to Dix and the Associated Press late on May 11th. Quote, "Dispatches from General Grant, dated at 8 o'clock this morning, have just reached Washington. He says, 'We have now ended the 6th day of very heavy fighting. The result to this time is much in our favor. Our losses have been heavy, as well as those of the enemy. I think the loss of the enemy must be greater. We have taken 5,000 prisoners in battle, while he has taken from us but few. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer.'"
The Republican press loved that one and made the final sentence of Grant's dispatch a battle cry. However, the Democratic-leaning New York World interpreted it differently on May 13th and put its own downbeat spin on Grant's famous phrase, quote, "We must frankly state our impression that the military aspect is not very hopeful. Even Grant is profoundly impressed with the sense of the Herculean magnitude of his task. He uses heroic and resolute words, but still the words of a man before whom difficulties are looming in portentous proportions.
But that was before the mule shoe. In its entire career, the Army of the Potomac had never done anything like it. That is, pierce Lee's main line, capture a rebel division, take 20 guns. And the North went wild with the news. Even the New York World exulted on May 14th, quote, "All doubt is at an end. After a series of desperate battles, contested on both sides with matchless valor, skill, and obstinacy, the Army of the Potomac has won a decided, if not decisive, victory."
The World went so far as to declare the battle on May 12th, quote, "is a great step toward the final possession of Richmond."
The Republican press was even less restrained. On May 16th, the Ohio State Journal crowed, "Triumphant news!" with 3 exclamation points. "The rebel army routed!" with 1 exclamation point. And the May 14th New York Times editorialized, quote, "The veteran army of Robert E. Lee is breaking up, or rather it is being defeated, demolished, crushed, and annihilated by the courage of our soldiers and the masterly generalship of their commander."
The Times insisted this was, quote, "not fantasy, but joyous fact, grim, solemn, terrible fact."
Hit pause on whatever you're listening to and hit play on your next adventure. Stay 2 nights and get a $50 Best Western gift card. Life's a trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Visit bestwestern.com for complete terms and conditions.
I just MailChimped my marketing.
You MailChimped your what?
I MailChimped my marketing with AI to create an effective marketing campaign in minutes.
No, MailChimp and Way.
Yes, MailChimp and Way. Now I can hyper-personalize my campaigns across email and SMS.
You can do all that with MailChimp?
What did I just MailChimp and say?
MailChimp your marketing with the #1 AI-powered email marketing and automation platform, Intuit MailChimp. #1 based on publicly available data on competitors' customers. Plans vary. SMS available as add-ons. Visit MailChimp.com.
While the Northern press trumpeted the success of the Army of the Potomac, they also reported that the cost of that success was high, and they did not hide the fact that the Army's losses were fearful.
On May 12th, even before it got word of the fight at the Mule Shoe, the New York Tribune overestimated federal losses at 40,000. On May 15th, the New York Times put total casualties at 20,000. On May 18th, the New York Herald, with fair accuracy, estimated the Army of the Potomac's loss, excluding Sheridan's cavalry, at 35,000.
Yet none of this seemed disheartening. On the contrary, taken in context, it seemed to reinforce the opinion that the Waterloo of the Civil War was at last at hand, with Grant playing the role of Wellington. However, that perception quickly diminished. It soon became obvious that the Confederate Army was not crushed, but had simply withdrawn to a new line. Democratic papers were quick to point this out. The World opined on May 17th, quote, "It is now definitely settled that so far no victory has been won."
True, the World said, Hancock had stormed the enemy works, captured many prisoners, and seized numerous cannon, quote, "but the rebels contested the field vigorously for the rest of the day, recovered some of the lost guns, repulsed all the attacks made upon them, and the battle at the close was, as all previous ones have been, indecisive."
Republican papers had to acknowledge the same thing, especially after word of Sigel's defeat in the Shenandoah Valley at Newmarket and Butler's reverse at Drury's Bluff below Richmond. But unlike the Democrats, they subjected these events to considerable spin control. Sigel, said the New York Times, prudently withdrew in the face of superior numbers, while both the Times and Tribune pointed to the quote-unquote signal advantages gained by Butler's foray toward Richmond.
Regarding the Army of the Potomac's main offensive itself, the Times continued its optimistic tone, but with a touch of defensiveness. On May 19th, it editorialized, "We know the great losses Grant's army has already suffered. We hear privately and otherwise of the fearful mud of Virginia. We learn that the soldiers are greatly exhausted with their recent fighting and marching. But we have seen also, under Grant's management in the West and in the East, what can be accomplished by able generalship."
But this, as May wore on, became increasingly a minority opinion. The Times would later note a public opinion backlash after May 12th as euphoria gave way to despondency. Even those inclined to put the best face on things began to discuss the state of events in Virginia more guardedly. One federal soldier who wrote his mother on May 17th contrasted encouraging reports from other points with, quote, "our somewhat negative success here." And one Union Army surgeon noted, quote, "It is true that we have driven the enemy at every point. Still, to all appearance, their lines are as complete and strong as ever."
On May 23rd, Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase wrote a friend, quote, "The people are crazy, or I am. I don't see the recent military successes. Most earnestly do I pray that we have them hereafter. All depends on Grant. So far he has achieved very little."
Noted diarist George Templeton Strong commented on the bad feeling in his own circles. On May 17th, he wrote that the sentiment in New York City was despondent. Quote, "People have taken up with an exaggerated view of Grant's hard-won success in the opening of the campaign, and now, finding that the backbone of the rebellion is not broken at last and that Lee still shows fight, they are disgusted and ready to believe any rumor of disaster that the wicked ingenuity of speculators can devise."
Strong's mention of speculators was a reference to the New York gold market, where gold and paper money, that is, greenbacks, were traded at rates of exchange tied heavily to perceptions of Union military success or failure.
In other words, the worse the Army of the Potomac appeared to fare, the higher the price of gold went. On May 4th, the day the Army crossed the Rapidan, gold stood at $179.50. That is, it took $179.50 in greenbacks to buy $100 in gold.
Grant's reported success in the Wilderness brought down the price to $168 on May 10th.
But then, as reports started to appear in the papers declaring that the Muleshoe victory was actually not much of a success, prices started to climb. $173.50 on Monday, May 16th, $177.50 the next day, and $184 on Wednesday, May 18th.
The Wednesday spike was due to an out-and-out attempt to capitalize on the death and suffering of the campaign in Virginia. That day, the New York Journal of Commerce and New York World published a proclamation from Abraham Lincoln that threw the markets into a frenzy.
The proclamation declared that Grant's campaign in Virginia was about to grind to an inconclusive halt, and that he, Lincoln, besides proclaiming a day of fasting and prayer, was calling for 400,000 new recruits and threatening to ramp up the draft in any northern state that failed to meet its quota of volunteers.
The proclamation, however, was bogus. It was planted by a fellow named Joseph Howard Jr., who was in cahoots with Wall Street speculators, hoping to take advantage of the turmoil that would certainly grip the markets when the fake proclamation hit the newspapers.
Every New York paper got a copy of the fake proclamation, but only the Democratic Journal of Commerce and New York World were unlucky enough to publish it before it was exposed as a fake. In Washington, Edwin Stanton chose to interpret their misfortune as intentional malice and had their editors arrested, despite the fact that both papers had immediately printed a retraction and, in the case of the World, even raced to retrieve issues of their paper that were aboard a steamer bound for London, since they knew the news would have wreaked havoc on American diplomatic and financial interests in Europe had it reached London.
Stanton, most agreed, overreacted, and in doing so, he added credence to Democratic charges that, during the war, the Lincoln administration trampled on civil liberties. Even the city's Republican newspaper publishers petitioned for the release of their Democratic colleagues, who were set free on May 23rd.
Even Joseph Howard got off after just 3 months' confinement at New York Harbor's Fort Lafayette, after influential clergyman Henry Ward Beecher persuaded the administration to release him.
The damage in the court of public opinion had been done, though, and nothing could undo it. The Northern home front, initially thrilled about the reported progress of Grant's campaign, had been bitterly disappointed not only by the scandal, but by the increasingly grim news from Virginia. And as a result, people were becoming less and less hopeful about the prospect of a decisive victory.
As Northern morale sunk, on the Confederate home front, by contrast, public opinion remained upbeat throughout the campaign. Most rebels had supreme confidence in Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, and so they were unimpressed by Grant's decision to continue his offensive rather than retreat back across the Rapidan.
One Confederate soldier wrote to his wife that Grant, quote, is twice as badly whipped now as was Burnside or Hooker. True, the soldier admitted, Grant was being rather pig-headed by refusing to acknowledge he was whipped, quote, but I think before he gets through with Lee, he will have to own up.
Southern reporting of the Overland Campaign was typically a mirror image of press coverage in the North. On May 9th, the same day that New York papers were trumpeting a Union victory in the Wilderness, the Richmond Examiner declared, "The great battle on the Rapidan, the enemy repulsed at all points and in retreat." It assured its readers, "If we win this first round, the game is our own. Nothing can prevent the collapse of the war party in the United States."
On May 18th, the Charleston Mercury boomed, "Great news from Virginia. Northern admissions of the defeat of Grant and Beauregard's victory over Butler."
After Spotsylvania, the Southern Literary Messenger declared that after just one more Confederate victory, the, quote, disheartened and disappointed North will be made to see the necessity of peace.
And yet, despite the Southern papers' confident declarations, Grant's determination to continue the campaign and keep pressing southward could not be ignored, and thus required explanation. An interpretation soon arose to account for the discrepancy that Lee had indeed beaten Grant, but Grant either was too dull to realize it or couldn't afford to admit it.
On May 10th, the Richmond Examiner assured its readers that Lee had, quote-unquote, whipped Grant in the Wilderness, and all the enemy army's subsequent move towards Spotsylvania proved was that Grant didn't realize yet he'd been whipped, even though he now commanded, quote, the ruins of an army.
Similarly, a North Carolina paper argued that Lee was beating Grant so badly that under normal circumstances, the Yankees would have already slunk back north with their tail between their legs. But Grant couldn't afford to do that because, quote, his final withdrawal is, to him and his country, the loss of all.
The image of Ulysses S. Grant, stubbornly refusing to admit Robert E. Lee had defeated him and instead continuing to drive forward a ruined, decimated Army of the Potomac, became a prominent theme of Southern editorials as the campaign went on. To Confederates, the Overland Campaign showed not the determination of Grant and the Lincoln administration, but rather their callous inhumanity.
On May 16th, the Richmond Examiner declared that Grant was one of those, quote, butchers of humanity to whom the sight of their fellow creature's blood is an intoxicating pleasure, end quote, and offered the opinion that since many Union veterans' 3-year enlistments were about up, the Lincoln administration was willing to let Grant lead the Army of the Potomac to destruction and incur heavy casualties in order to, quote, save it the trouble of giving the discharge to these veterans.
Nevertheless, warned a May 20th editorial, quote, Grant is no contemptible antagonist. We may believe him doomed, but still he is dangerous. And then, using the word depletion where we would use attrition, the paper continued, quote, he has deliberately counted on depletion, and a fearful depletion too, fearful to any man of less obstinacy and less selfishness. If he can effect, with every assault on our lines, not an equal but a proportionate depletion of our ranks, then the satisfactory solution to the problem is, from his point of view, a mere question of arithmetic, a mere question of time. He would coolly throw away 100,000 of his men, if by that means he could put 50,000 of ours out of action.
A subsequent editorial likened Grant to a fanatic gambler who is desperately committed to a flawed betting strategy in which, quote, he shall stake pile after pile of chips until his last man is gone.
And thus the seeds of the image of Grant as a butcher were sown, since the piles of chips in question were, of course, the lives of the men in the Army of the Potomac. What isn't often noted, though, is that Robert E. Lee had his own chips. Not as many, and not dwindling quite as fast at present, but nonetheless Lee was willing to spend his piles of chips in order to keep the Confederacy a going concern. And as we'll see, he would continue to do so, even after the Confederacy's fall became, to use the Richmond Examiner's phrase, a mere question of time. In any case, to return to the question we asked at the top of the show, what was being purchased by all of this death and suffering? When every one of those losses translated not just to a number on a casualty list, but was also a dead or injured or missing comrade or friend or family member? Well, really, after the Wilderness, Laurel Hill, Cloyd's Mountain, the Mule Shoe, Spotsylvania, Newmarket, Drury's Bluff, the engagements along the North Anna, well, even after so many battles, with so many dead, still, as May 1864 gave way to June, no one yet knew the outcome of the campaign, and so no one yet knew what was being purchased by all of this death and suffering.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust.
With This Republic of Suffering, Faust looks at the impact of the enormous death toll of the Civil War from many different angles. She explores the way death changed not only individual lives, but the life of the nation, as survivors mourned and a deeply religious culture struggled to reconcile the slaughter on the battlefield with the idea of a benevolent, loving God.
You can find all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Jamie L. did recently.
Then, as the curtain comes down on this episode, we'll remind you that the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of each show is from the song Midnight on the Water, and we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music.
And with that, we'll say thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time when we'll get the armies to Cold Harbor. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.